Disney. They might be a frightening force that's slowly but surely consuming the entire world. As creepy as the corporate side is though, it's not all bad of course. Whether it's inspiring children with its classic cartoons, reuniting the Marvel family or bringing a new hope to a galaxy far far away, Disney does at the very least do a lot of good for the entertainment industry. And for an old Nintendo nerd like myself, quite possibly the best thing they ever did was to collaborate with the video game wizards at Capcom. This collaboration not only led to some of the best licensed video games of all time, but in my opinion some of the best video games of all time, period. You wouldn't expect that from the way things started though. This legendary partnership, like most legends, came from humble beginnings. The first Capcom Disney game was Mickey Mousecapade, though this one was only published by Capcom and the actual developer was Hudson Soft. For the most part, this is a very generic 80s platformer where you just go around jumping over pits and throwing stars at cartoony enemies. And sure, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but most games need at least something to make them stand out. And well, I guess there actually is one thing that's unique about this game, though I wouldn't say it's something that changes the game for the better. As the game's title would imply, you play the game as Mickey Mouse, but you also have Minnie following you throughout the game. I guess Hudson does deserve some manner of credit for not making Minnie a damsel in distress you need to rescue like most games at the time would, but what they went with instead does come with its own set of problems. While you control Mickey directly, Minnie will automatically follow after you. For the most part it does work pretty well, but anytime you have to jump on small platforms or climb ladders, it becomes a bit of a problem. We're dealing with 8-bit AI here after all, so there's a pretty big chance she'll get stuck somewhere along the way, and if she does you have to go back and get her, because you can't progress in the game without Minnie following you. And no, sadly you can't let another player control her either. Well, at the very least, Minnie can't take damage, so you won't have to worry about keeping her away from enemies. And you can even use her immortality to cheat your way past some of the game's bosses. Don't expect this kind of generosity when it comes to the platforming though. If you let Minnie fall into a pit, you will lose a life. But thankfully there isn't too much precision platforming required in the game. Mickey Mousecapade is by no means a terrible game, and back in the day when it was first released, there wasn't really many options available for Disney fans looking for a video game fix. However, considering how many better Mickey Mouse games have been released in the years since then, both by Capcom themselves and by other companies, it's a bit hard to go back to this one today. Next up, however, is a game that's definitely not hard to go back to. A game that perhaps better than any other represents the genius of the Capcom Disney collaboration. And that game is of course DuckTales. This game is not only even to this day a benchmark for quality licensed games, but even for platformers in general. Every single one of the game's 5 huge and expertly designed levels are filled to the brim with fun challenges and cool secrets to discover. I think it says quite a lot that I have literally played this game hundreds of times, and I'm still regularly discovering new secrets. But not only is it extremely fun to explore the levels, the regular gameplay is super fun as well. The movement controls are amazingly tight and responsive, and Scrooge's ability to pogo jump on his walking stick has become one of the most iconic moves of the 8-bit generation. This stylish move not only allows you to attack enemies, but also move across dangerous spikes and gain extra jump height by bouncing off enemies' heads. The cane can also be used as a golf club to launch rocks and other objects like projectiles. DuckTales also does a really admirable job of capturing the look of the cartoon it was based on. Of course, as to be expected, it is a little bit limited by the 8-bit hardware, and Scrooge wears his red cape from the comics instead of the blue one he wore in the cartoon. But those are just two extremely desperate nitpicks, and I really don't think they could have possibly done a greater job than what they already did. And if the graphics were great, then the music is quite possibly even better, with everything from the great 8-bit rendition of the cartoon's theme song to the iconic Moon music holding a guaranteed place in the Video Game Music Hall of Fame. The only really negative thing I have to say about DuckTales is that it's a bit on the short side. Once you know what you're doing, you can easily beat the game in less than 20 minutes. This might have made the game feel like a bit of a rip-off back in the day when it was first released. But like I said before, there are so many things to discover in this game that you couldn't possibly find it all in just one playthrough. And if the secrets and multiple difficulty levels aren't enough for you, the game also features 3 different endings. The normal ending you get from just beating the game, the extra good ending you get by collecting 2 secret treasures and $10 million over the course of the game, and finally the surprisingly hard to get sad ending, which requires you to jump through a lot of hoops to end the game with exactly $0. On the very off chance that you own a NES but not this game, then you should really make buying DuckTales your number 1 priority. It's not a very expensive game, and it's honestly one of the best gaming experiences you can have on any system. And of course, with a game as popular as DuckTales, and the Game Boy being the new hot thing, this game naturally also got a port for Nintendo's portable system. The Game Boy port of DuckTales is a pretty good game considering it was very early in the Game Boy's lifetime. However, as is often the case with early games on a system, all the programming tricks hadn't been discovered yet. And of course the cartridge space was a lot smaller than it would be on other games further down the line. So at this time it would be hard to get a game as advanced as DuckTales onto the Game Boy without making some sacrifices. And in this particular case, the sacrifices came in the form of level size and frame rate. While the levels are still fun to explore, they are significantly more compact in this version, which I guess also makes sense for the smaller screen. The NES version is definitely superior, but if you like me have played that one to death already, then it's actually nice to pop this one in every once in a while to get even more new things to discover. But the frame rate dips are a bit less fun. For the most part the game plays fine, but anytime there's a lot going on screen at once, the game will slow to a crawl. I can probably attribute more deaths here to the frame rate than to the actual enemies, which is never a good thing to have to say about a game. But enough of the old DuckTales magic shines through here that I can still call this a good game, even despite some pretty serious problems. But definitely prioritize the NES version. And hey, speaking of which, how could Capcom possibly follow up on a masterpiece like the NES version of DuckTales? Well, with another masterpiece of course. A masterpiece called Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers. Unlike DuckTales, which put a big emphasis on exploring big and open levels, this game is a much more traditional action-focused platformer. This means that the level designs are a lot more linear, but that doesn't mean that they're any less fun, just fun in a different way. As much as I love DuckTales, it's a very easy game, so the fun of it is more about the sense of adventure and discovery. And while Rescue Rangers isn't very difficult either, at least compared to most other NES games, it's still tricky enough to give you that sense of accomplishment for overcoming a challenge. Unlike Mr. McD, Chip and Dale don't carry any weapons, so instead you attack the enemies by picking up and throwing boxes and other objects you find in the levels. You can only throw objects left, right or straight up, but that's enough to deal with any enemy the game throws at you. Though you can also hide inside boxes by pressing down. This will automatically kill any weak enemy that touches you, and it can also deflect some projectiles. Of course, I can't neglect to mention that Rescue Rangers is also one of the best multiplayer games on the NES. Playing the game with a friend not only makes it a lot more fun, but also more challenging, since you can accidentally attack each other, which won't cause damage, but will cause the other player to get stunned momentarily. One really neat feature is that, say one player is really bad at platforming, the other player can actually pick them up and carry them over the difficult platforming sections. Or, you could also do it just to be an asshole. This feature was so good that even Nintendo themselves would steal it for future games like New Super Mario Bros. And Donkey Kong Country Returns. Just like DuckTales, Rescue Rangers also has really beautiful graphics. In fact, I'd say they're even better than DuckTales. Mostly because there's more variety, and because Chip and Dale's small size allows for more interesting environments, such as jumping over cooking pots in a restaurant or traversing a giant toy store. I don't think the soundtrack is quite on par with DuckTales though, but it is still very good. And to be fair, there are a lot more music tracks in this game, so they probably didn't have as much time to dedicate to each and every one of them. Even though it was just as popular as DuckTales, Rescue Rangers never got a port to the Game Boy. However, we did get another game that was very similar in style, and that game was Mickey's Dangerous Chase. In this game you play as either Mickey or Minnie Mouse, and your goal is to stop Pete, who has stolen a present that Mickey had bought for Minnie. Goofy is also there to quote-unquote help out. He is always ahead of Mickey and Minnie, and at the end of the level he tells you which direction Pete was going. But yet he never catches up to Pete. Well, surely Goofy couldn't be on Pete's side, right? Anyway, the gameplay is basically the same as it was in Rescue Rangers. The only real difference is that you can't hide inside the boxes in this one. As expected though, the levels are a lot simpler and shorter than the ones in Rescue Rangers. But the game is still fun, and you do get some variety as well, like a couple of levels where you get to ride a vehicle. The game's presentation is pretty good for the time and for the Game Boy. The graphics are for the most parts okay, but strangely one of the worst looking things are Mickey and Minnie themselves. It almost looks like their sprites belong in a completely different game. It's not too bad, but it is a bit distracting. But on a more positive note, there is a pretty good amount of variety with both environments and enemies. And even though it's a bit screechy, the game does have a pretty good soundtrack as well. Disney's other two rodents definitely did beat Mickey and Minnie this time, but still in a way I am kind of glad that we got a unique game with similar gameplay for the Game Boy, instead of just a watered down port of Rescue Rangers. Now getting back to the NES, DuckTales and Rescue Rangers were pretty much universally loved by everyone. But they were far from the only Capcom Disney games on the NES. So now let's get into the ones that are a bit more divisive. First up is TailSpin. You know, the one where the animals from the Jungle Book run a flight delivery service in the 1930s. Man, now that I think about it, we didn't ask a lot of questions back in the 90s, did we? Anyway, unlike the previous games, which were all platformers, this one was instead a horizontally scrolling shoot-em-up, which makes sense since airplanes was such a huge part of the show. This game did however have a couple of gimmicks that made it stand out quite a bit from other shoot-em-up games. Firstly, when you fly up or down, the entire plane will tilt. This also means that your bullets will go diagonally if you shoot while going up or down. This seems to be the main thing people take issue with this game. And sure, I can kind of see why. I mean, if you need to shoot something that's right in front of you and need to dodge up or down at the same time, it is fairly easy to accidentally angle your shot. But personally, I actually kind of like this system. I think it gives more strategic options, since you can actually shoot at enemies without getting right in front of them. And the game is slower paced than most other shooters. So as long as you don't stress out too much, you should usually have enough time to both aim your shots and dodge enemy attacks. Your second unique ability in TailSpin is to be able to flip your plane. Like most shoot-em-ups, this game automatically scrolls from left to right. But with a simple press of the A button you can flip your plane around and start going backwards right to left instead. And it will definitely be necessary to use this feature if you don't want to get crushed in some of the later levels of the game. There's also specific points in each level where you can shoot a bullet to unlock a secret door. These doors lead to bonus missions where you get to play as Baloo's sidekick Kit. These are just straightforward courses where you try to collect as many balloons as possible within a time limit. But they're a fun diversion nonetheless, and they can earn you some bonus points and extra lives. Unlike most shoot-em-up games, you can't collect any power-up items in TailSpin. Instead you collect crates of goods and money bags. Your earnings from these items can then be used to buy upgrades from your mechanic Wildcat, or you could also use them to buy extra lives and continues. I personally think this is a pretty fun system, and it also makes each power-up feel a bit more valuable since it's permanent and you have to earn it instead of just collecting it. Graphically, TailSpin is not quite as good as DuckTales or Rescue Rangers, but it's still far above average for a NES game, and like the other games it does do a good job of capturing the look of the show. And the same goes for the soundtrack. It's really good, but not quite as good as the previous two NES games. While it's not the best of the Capcom Disney games, I still think that TailSpin is a superb shoot-em-up. I know that not everyone agrees with me here, but you should at least give it a try and see for yourself. TailSpin also got a really excellent port for the Game Boy. In fact, even though the game itself is not as good, I actually think this is a better Game Boy port than DuckTales. Okay, it is missing a bit of the content from the NES version, including the entire haunted house level, but I feel like they did a better job of transferring the core gameplay here than they did with DuckTales. Next up we have the Little Mermaid. This was the first of the games to be based on an actual Disney movie. Well, I say it's based on the movie, but it's actually more of an alternate reality version of the movie. In the game, Ursula apparently turned Ariel into a human without taking her voice in return. And in this reality I guess it was Ariel and not Triton's trident that stopped Ursula from taking over the sea, because according to the intro, as soon as Ariel is gone she pretty much takes over instantly. And this version of Ariel also doesn't need Eric to joust the revenge Ursula for her. Nah, she's a strong independent mermaid who don't need no human, so she sets out to fix the problem herself. Gameplay-wise, the Little Mermaid is kind of a mix between the previous three NES games I talked about, with a little splash of Bubble Bubble thrown in for good measure. You can move freely around on the screen like in TailSpin, and even though the game is linear, there's a lot of secret items to find just like in DuckTales. And you also attack by picking up and throwing objects like in Rescue Rangers. But if you don't have any items to throw, you can also shoot bubbles to trap the enemies. And an enemy that is caught in a bubble can actually be picked up and used as a projectile itself. But I'm not saying that the game is completely derivative. Even though there are similarities to other games, it still definitely feels like its own unique experience when you play it. This game was also made before the industry arbitrarily decided that female players don't like challenging games. So even though the core audience for this game was young girls, it still packs quite a challenge. There's a good variety of different enemies in the game, and a lot of them are too strong to be captured by Ariel's basic bubble attack. So to defeat them you will need to capture and throw weaker enemies at them, or alternatively get power-ups that will allow you to capture stronger enemies, which you can usually find by solving simple puzzles in the level. The Little Mermaid is a fantastically fun and underrated NES game. Though I'm sorry if I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, it's not quite as fun as DuckTales and Rescue Rangers. Then again, very few games are. But credit where credit's due, I think the graphics of The Little Mermaid are actually a bit better than those two games, especially the animations on Ariel herself. I mean, she even has a turning animation, which was very rare for a NES sprite. Or hell, it's even rare in modern 2D games. And as for the music, well, the soundtrack is really fantastic, but I still think I have to say that it's the weakest of the Capcom Disney games on the NES. Well, except for Mickey Mousecapade if you want to count that one. And yes, The Little Mermaid also got a port for the Game Boy, and it's probably the best of the Capcom Disney ports for the Game Boy so far. Not only does it do a really good job of capturing the NES game, but unlike TailSpin, it also doesn't cut any of the levels from the game. In fact, aside from some minor downgrades to the presentation, there really doesn't appear to be many differences between this game and its NES counterpart. So now we've looked at games based on TV shows, a movie, and even a couple based on the Big Mouse himself. So what's next? Well, what about a game based on a theme park? No, not a game where you build a theme park. I mean what I said quite literally, a video game based on a theme park. More specifically, Disney World. The plot of the game is that the 6 silver keys that are required to open Cinderella Castle has disappeared, and the castle must be opened before the daily Disney parade can begin. So Mickey, Donald and Goofy send you into the park to look for them. You can name the kid you play as, but if you don't give him a name it defaults to Bamboo 7 for some reason. Perhaps because he was Disney's 7th attempt at cloning Indiana Jones before they just gave up and bought the real thing. The game itself is kind of like a collection of mini-games. The hub of the game is the Magic Kingdom theme park itself, and I have to say it's absolutely beautiful. When I was a kid I didn't know that this game was based on Disney World, but I still just loved walking around and exploring the park. And from the main hub you can also access 5 different attractions. Space Mountain is probably my least favorite. It's kind of a Dragon's Lair style quick-time event game, only without the graphics that made Dragon's Lair fun. And then there's Big Thunder Mountain, where you have to drive a train down to a specific station, while avoiding things like rocks and landslides. This one is a lot more fun than Space Mountain, but the difficulty is kind of randomized, since the A and D stations are really easy to get to, while the B and C stations are much harder. Then we have Autopia, which is a simple top-down racing stage. Even though Mickey tells you that it's a race at the start of the level, you're not actually racing any of the other cars. You simply need to make it to the end of the stage without falling out of the track. The other cars are mostly there just to be in your way, but you can actually push your opponents off the track, which I have to admit I found immensely fun when I was a kid. Who am I trying to kid here? I still find it immensely fun. It's an enjoyable level, but there's not really much to it. But it is actually the first time I remember having fun while driving a vehicle in a video game. And you know, that has to count for something at least. But by far the best part of this game is Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion. These are the 2 classic Capcom side-scroller levels, and in my opinion some of the best ones they ever made. In the Haunted Mansion level you have to get from the graveyard outside of the mansion to the attic floor, where you have to defeat the boss ghost. You attack the enemy ghosts by throwing candles, though you start out with a very limited amount of them, so you'll have to collect more as you progress through the level. In the Pirates of the Caribbean level, on the other hand, you have to make your way through a cool burning pirate town, while also saving 6 captured villagers. Here you don't actually have any weapons until the very end of the stage, so this one is more about platforming and trying to avoid enemies. The game is for the most part not very difficult, but if you do find any part of the game challenging, you can push the select button at any time to bring up a shop. Here you can use the stars you find in the game to buy things like extra lives or invisibility, so you never have to be stuck permanently. And well, that's about it for the 5 main stages. Each stage you beat gives you one of the 6 silver keys. But what about the last of the keys? Well, the final key is actually found in the park itself. The other visitors in the park will ask you Disney trivia questions, and if you answer all of them correctly, the final key will be yours. Though there's not actually any punishment for getting a question wrong. Just talk to the person again and they will ask you another question. And that's lucky because some of these questions are actually really difficult. And that's Adventures in the Magic Kingdom. This is not one of the most popular Capcom Disney games. In fact, a lot of people seem to even hate it. And well, I can see a bit of the negative aspects. The game is extremely short. You can pretty much beat it in about 15 minutes if you know what you're doing. And of the 5 levels, only 2 are really excellent, while 2 of them are fairly good and 1 is pretty bad. Even so, maybe it's just my nostalgia talking, but I still absolutely love this game. The park itself really evokes the feeling of being a kid exploring an actual theme park. And the game plays just as well as any other Capcom game, which is to say very well. And of course it doesn't hurt that the graphics are amazing, and the soundtrack is good enough to rival even, here it comes, DuckTales and Rescue Rangers. Or I don't know, perhaps I'm just patriotic because us Scandinavians got 100 times cooler box art for this game than the rest of the world. Either way, I highly recommend giving this game a try since it's one of my personal favorites. Just be aware that it's not for everyone. But now let's get back to the Disney afternoon, with the terror that flaps in the night, the onion that stings you in the eye, the metal key on the sardine can of justice, the daring duck of mystery himself, Darkwing Duck. This game is often considered a sort of honorary 7th Mega Man game on the NES, and there's certainly some merit to that comparison. The basic movement, jumping and shooting feels very much in line with the Blue Bombers NES games. And also like in Mega Man you can select the order in which you play the levels. Though here you only have half the levels to begin with, and then after you beat those you unlock the second half. And also unlike Mega Man, the order in which you play the levels doesn't really matter since you don't unlock any new powers after beating a stage. That's not to say that DW doesn't have any additional tricks in his arsenal. Aside from your standard shots, you can collect 3 other kinds of ammunition as well. There's the heavy ammunition that launches a ball of gas, and upon impact with a platform, this gas will launch a bullet to both the right and left simultaneously. Then there's the thunder ammo that launches 2 bolts of lightning, one diagonally up and one diagonally down. And finally the one I find the most useful, the arrow ammo. This launches a plunger that will stick to walls, and after that the plunger can be used as an additional platform. Instead of getting these special powers from bosses, you collect them like normal power-ups in the level. And once you have them you can use them as much as you like, as long as you have enough gas energy, which you get from defeating normal enemies. Darkwing does have a couple of other special abilities as well. He can grab onto the bottom of most platforms and then jump up through the platform. It's one of the more interesting abilities that helps set the game apart from the Mega Man comparison, and the level design also does make very good use of it. Last but not least, by holding up on the D-pad, Darkwing can also use his cape to defend himself against most enemy projectiles. Darkwing Duck might not be quite as unique as the other Capcom Disney games on the NES, but that by no means makes it a bad game. It might just be a standard action platformer, but it's a really excellent standard action platformer. And the presentation sticks to the same extremely high standards as the previous Capcom Disney games. Just be aware that this game is slightly more rare than the previous games. It's not one of those really expensive NES games, but it will cost you a bit more than a common NES cart. There's also a version of this game for the Game Boy, and like the other Game Boy ports, this is pretty much a simplified version of the NES game. Sadly though, of all the Game Boy ports, this is probably the one where the downgrades from the NES version are the most apparent. Especially when it comes to the music, which, while not terrible on its own, does sound pretty bad when compared to the same track on the NES version. But even though it's not a great port, I'm not saying that this is a bad game. It is still fun to play, and all the levels from the NES version are still here, even if they have been simplified a bit. It's no replacement for the NES version, but it is a decent enough companion piece. Now, while we're on the subject of the Game Boy, let's jump over to a game that was released exclusively for Nintendo's Grey and Green Portable. That game being Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Now, as you're probably aware, there was a Who Framed Roger Rabbit game on the NES as well, but that game wasn't from Capcom, and nor was it a very good game in general. However, this Game Boy version is a completely different game, and aside from the name and the movie it was based on, it has pretty much nothing to do with the NES version. So what exactly is this game then? Well, it's kind of a top-down adventure game. There are some action elements, but the majority of the game will be spent talking to people and solving simple puzzles. It won't pose much of a challenge to people who are used to classic LucasArts or Sierra adventure games, but I do think it's a pretty good introduction to the genre for kids. The puzzles should provide a decent challenge for younger players without ever becoming too frustrating. And even if you do get stuck, you can usually get a clue on what to do next from Roger's pal Eddie Valiant. When you do get to an action sequence, the game plays pretty much like a standard top-down action game. However, one thing that sets it apart is that your weapon only knocks enemies down, and after a few seconds they will get right back up again. So it's more about just getting past the enemies rather than actually defeating them all. The exception being the bosses, which you do of course have to defeat, but they're pretty easy for the most part. When it comes to the presentation, the game has a pretty decent soundtrack. Okay, it's not Capcom's best and it could use a bit more variety, but what we do get is of good quality, and it has kind of a noir style which fits well with the Roger Rabbit movie. I will admit though, the music was the one thing I thought was better in the NES version. It is hard to compete with David Wise after all. And when it comes to the graphics, well, they're pretty good too. Absolutely nothing to complain about, but not really anything special either. Roger Rabbit on the Game Boy is often forgotten when talking about the classic Capcom Disney games. And that's too bad, because it is actually a really good game. And it's pretty cheap too, so it's well worth adding to your Game Boy collection. Now let's jump back to the NES again to have a look at the two final Capcom Disney games for the system, starting with Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers 2. As I'm sure you clever boys and girls have figured out, this is a sequel to the original Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers, aka one of the two games I haven't been able to shut up about in this episode. So how does this game measure up against the fantastic original? Well, first impressions are great at least. The gameplay is just as good as it was in the original, and they even added some minor improvements, such as being able to throw boxes diagonally. And they also made the boss battles way more varied and challenging. On top of that, there have also been some slight improvements to the graphics, which you'd expect since this game was released almost 4 years after the original. Yet, in spite of all these improvements, I'm sad to say that this game is not as good as the first one. It mostly comes down to the level design, which just isn't nearly as fun and interesting as it was in the first game. I'm not saying it's bad, but it just can't compare to the fantastic original. On top of that, there's also fewer levels in this game, and with a couple of exceptions, the themes for the levels are not nearly as interesting either. Last but not least, the music has also taken a noticeable step down compared to the first game. It's still good, but not nearly as good. And that last bit pretty much summarizes the entire game. It is still a very good game when judged on its own merits. It's just that the first game is even better. And it also doesn't help that this was a late NES release, so the price of an original cartridge has gone up quite a bit. Still, if you love the original and want more of the same thing, then this game is definitely worth checking out. Now, it's time for the final Capcom Disney game on the NES. And believe it or not, but I actually saved the best for last. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you DuckTales 2. Now, for some reason, a lot of people seem to think that this game is worse than the original, and I've even seen some people who claim to like the first game call this one outright bad. And to those people, I only have one question. Why? This game has everything that made the original game great, but it also improves upon it in almost every way possible. It not only has more levels than the original, but the levels are also bigger and more well designed. The levels also have more interesting themes and way better graphics. And there's way more incentive to explore the levels this time, because you don't only find treasure in the secret areas, but also hidden map pieces, which if you collect them all will not only give you an alternate ending, but also an entire extra level to the game. And you can even find Gyro at several points in the game who will upgrade your abilities to allow you to explore even more secret areas. Hell, in my opinion, even the music is better in this game. Sure, there is no song that is as iconic as the Moon theme from the original game, but if you look at the entire soundtrack overall, I think this one wins out. In my opinion, DuckTales 2 isn't just the best of the Capcom Disney games, but it might actually be my favorite game in the entire NES library. And that's saying quite a lot. Of course, if you still prefer the original game, that's completely fine. That's a masterpiece in its own right. Just promise that you at least give this fantastic sequel a chance. Like Darkwing Duck and Rescue Rangers 2, this one is a bit more expensive than the average NES cart, but I absolutely guarantee that it's more than well worthy of its price. DuckTales 2 wasn't just my favorite of these games on the NES though, it also got an absolutely fantastic Game Boy port. I've even heard some people say that they think the Game Boy version is better than the NES version. I wouldn't go that far, but it is an amazing port nevertheless. All the levels from the NES version are here, but they have been altered quite a bit. However, unlike the Game Boy port of the original DuckTales where it felt like the levels had been constricted by the Game Boy hardware, here it feels more like they have been optimized for it. And speaking of optimization, there's also way less slowdown this time. The Game Boy version also adds in several items that were not in the NES version, such as X-ray glasses that allow you to see where invisible diamonds are hidden, and a special chest that tells you how many treasures there are left to find in the level. Personally, I think it's more fun to find these things on my own, but it is still a cool addition. If you're looking for a good platformer adventure on the Game Boy, then you'd be hard-pressed to find anything better than DuckTales 2. And it's also way cheaper than the NES version, so there's really no excuse not to add it to your collection. But we've been talking about 8-bit games for quite a while now, so I think it's about time that we power up and have a look at the Capcom Disney games on the Super Nintendo. And first up on that list is The Magical Quest starring Mickey Mouse. You of course play the game as Mickey Mouse himself, who's on a somewhat magical quest to rescue Pluto, who has been kidnapped by the evil Baron Pete. On the surface, this game is a pretty standard 16-bit platformer. You can attack enemies by picking up and throwing special boxes at them. Or alternatively, you can jump on the enemies once to stun them, and then pick up and throw the enemies themselves, which actually does more damage than the boxes do. However, the unique hook of the magical quest were the special costumes that Mickey could wear. You could dress up as a magician to shoot magical attacks, or a fireman that can spray water, and even a mountain climber with a bionic commando-style grappling hook. The magician and fireman costume only have a limited amount of energy, but you can refill it by collecting special power-ups in the levels. These costumes do a lot to help the game stand out, and they all have several different uses. For instance, Fireman Mickey's water hose can obviously be used to put out fires, but it can also be used for several other things, such as pushing enemies. And in the ice level you can even use it to create frozen platforms. This is not only necessary for standard level progression, but also for finding secret areas that contain useful items such as extra lives, or shops that allow you to buy things with the coins you collect in the game, including upgrades to your costumes which make them use less energy. Now, being a Super Nintendo game, there has of course been a few upgrades to the graphics and sound compared to the old 8-bit games. The game looks absolutely gorgeous even to this day. And of course, just the fact that you have 4 different sprite sets for the main character is pretty impressive in its own right. Though perhaps the level teams could have done with a bit more creativity. It's mostly just the standard forest, lava, ice level type of deal. But now I'm just being nitpicky. The music is also absolutely beautiful, and technically it's a huge leap above the old 8-bit games. I will admit that some of the NES soundtracks were a lot more hummable, but this is a different kind of music, it's more about setting the mood here. Magical Quest was a great start for the 16-bit generation of Capcom Disney games, and even though it wasn't quite as amazing as some of the NES games, it was still a fantastic experience in its own right. 10 years later, the Magical Quest also got a port for the Game Boy Advance. This was for the most part a fairly faithful port. Okay, the sound has taken a noticeable dip in quality compared to the Super Nintendo original, but the game more than compensates for that with some really neat additions, most notably the ability to play the entire game as Minnie. They also added a few bonus challenge levels that can be played with 2 players using the GBA link cable, and they were even nice enough to let you do this with just 1 cartridge. On top of this, they also added a save feature, which even though the game can be beaten in about an hour, is really nice to have when you're playing portably. The game probably would have done just fine without these additions, but you know, that little bit of extra effort goes a long way in showing that the developers care about the game and the people who play it. Maybe something today's big budget game developers could learn a thing or two from. But now we'll step away from magical quests for a while and move on to magical lamps. Yep, that's right, it's time to have a look at the Super Nintendo version of Aladdin. This game was once again a platformer, which was what Capcom did best after all. And this also allowed them to make full use of the license, since Aladdin was a pretty acrobatic character in the movie, which is well represented in the game. Aside from the standard jumping and running, Aladdin can hang from the edge of platforms and also grab onto and swing from certain objects in the background. There's also certain platforms that are too narrow to stand on, but you can bounce on them to make your jump reach further. You can also bounce on the heads of enemies, which is your main form of attack in the game, though you do also have a limited number of apples that you can throw as projectiles. As per usual, the game has really nice graphics, especially some of the cool extra details they added. Like for instance, in some levels, other characters like Abu or the genie will be following you in the background. It's another one of those cool little extra touches I talked about before that makes it feel like the developers really cared about the game. The soundtrack is great too, but nothing really screams Aladdin about it. You do get SNES versions of the songs A Whole New World and Friend Like Me, but the rest of the soundtrack feels more like leftovers from the Magical Quest. Not that there's anything wrong with that, since the Magical Quest had great music. And it's not like these tunes feel completely out of place here, it's just not quite as spot on as some of the other soundtracks. Now, you can't really talk about Aladdin on the Super Nintendo without mentioning the game it was up against. Aladdin was actually one of the most important battlefields in the 16-bit console wars, and the Mega Drive version was an absolute beast. Sure, the SNES version had Capcom's expertise at programming and level design, but the Mega Drive version had access to the entire movie soundtrack and actual Disney animators for the graphics. So as great as the Capcom version was, it really couldn't compete in terms of presentation. I personally think that the Capcom version was actually more fun and more in line with the movie. But whether you agree with me or not, there's no denying that in this case Sega won out in the end. It became one of the most popular games in the entire Mega Drive library, and pretty much every other version of Aladdin, including the NES and Game Boy games, were derived from the Sega version. But Capcom's Aladdin game did at least get one more chance to shine, though not until about 10 years later, when it, just like the Magical Quest, got a re-release for the Game Boy Advance. The GBA version is a very straightforward port of the SNES game. Except for a save feature, there's not really any additional content here like there was in the Magical Quest port. But at least it's a very good version of the game, and they did do a much better job of porting the music from the SNES version here than they did with Magical Quest. And speaking of the Magical Quest, I think it's about time we have a look at that game's sequel. For whatever reason, this game was renamed to the Great Circus Mystery. But make no mistake about it, this is definitely the successor to the Magical Quest. The core gameplay here will be very familiar if you played the original game, but naturally there are some changes as well. The 3 special costumes from the original game has been replaced by 3 brand new ones. This time your options include the sweeper costume that can suck up things with a vacuum cleaner, the safari suit that lets you climb on almost any surface, and also allows you to slide down ropes and swing from these round things in the background, and finally the cowboy suit that allows you to jump higher and also gives you a chargeable gun attack. Like the GBA port of the original Magical Quest, this one lets you choose between playing the game as Mickey or Minnie, though this one takes it a step further by also allowing simultaneous 2-player multiplayer. As for the presentation, well, it's still great quality stuff, though it's pretty much the same as it was in the original, so I don't have too much to say about it. Overall though, I'd probably say that this game is a little bit better than the first one, mostly thanks to the multiplayer mode and in my opinion slightly better level design. Though a lot of other people seem to prefer the original game, but I say definitely give this one a chance at least. You can even get a version of this game for the Sega Mega Drive, though only in the United States and Japan, it was never released here in Europe. It's still pretty cool though, since this was the only Capcom Disney game to ever get released on a Sega console. Just like its predecessor, the Great Circus Mystery also got a GBA port, though this time with the more appropriate title Magical Quest 2. This one didn't get any additional content aside from a save feature. Now that is a bit disappointing considering the great extra content the first game got. But at the very least, even though the game is portable, they did keep the multiplayer mode in, though both players will need a copy of the game. And speaking of multiplayer, let's move on to the next game, which just so happens to be one of the best multiplayer experiences on the Super Nintendo. I'm of course talking about Goof Troop. With this game, Capcom took a step away from its platformer comfort zone, and instead gave us a simple top-down adventure game. The game is divided into levels, but each level is fairly big with several branching paths, so you will need to do some exploring rather than just going from point A to point B. And along the way there's of course also enemies to fight and puzzles to solve. Combat in Goof Troop takes a cue from Rescue Rangers, since your main form of attack is picking up and throwing various objects. Of course it feels a bit different when it's from a top-down perspective rather than a side-scroller, but one thing that definitely remains the same is that it's really fun and satisfying. They even added a little bit of extra depth, since you can actually hold your arms up in the air to catch certain enemy projectiles, and then use them as weapons for yourself. As for the puzzle solving, it's usually either about pushing blocks to designated areas, or finding a certain item to get past an obstacle, like for instance using a grappling hook to climb over a hole in the ground. The graphics in Goof Troop are not quite as good and well animated as the ones in Magical Quest or Aladdin, but they're still very appealing and do their job more than good enough. And the sound I'd actually say is better than the other games. It has absolutely wonderful music and some great cartoony sound effects as well. The best thing about this game though, as I implied at the start, is the 2-player mode. It is still a very good game in single player, but the fun is greatly multiplied when playing with a friend. Max and Goofy, the 2 playable characters, actually have some very distinct advantages and disadvantages, with Goofy being about twice as strong as Max, and Max on the other hand being about twice as fast as Goofy. This really helps to encourage teamwork between the players, since each character is more well suited for certain types of situations. And this need for cooperation is also further enhanced by the fact that each player only gets one inventory slot for special items, while in single player mode you get 2. You will also need to be more careful during combat, since just like in Rescue Rangers you can accidentally stun your partner if you hit them with one of your attacks. If one player gets a game over, it's not a huge deal though, since as long as the other player makes it to the next room, the player that got the game over can jump right back in again. This does severely reduce the difficulty of the game, but I think it's a worthy sacrifice, since it lets people of different skill levels play the game together. And hey, if you want to add more challenge, you can always choose not to use the continues. Goof Troop is an absolute blast to play, and even if you're stuck without a second player, it's still one of the best, if not even the best Capcom Disney game on the Super Nintendo. Now, let's have a look at the final game in the Magical Quest trilogy, the Magical Quest 3 starring Mickey and Donald. Now, the Super Nintendo version of this game was only ever released in Japan, so what I'm playing here is a fan-translated repro. But there is a legit way to play the game in English as well, which we'll get to soon enough. As the title would suggest, this game gives you the option of playing as the objectively best of the classic Disney characters, Donald Duck. Though if you for whatever reason prefer to play as a lesser character, you can of course still choose to play as Mickey. As per the series tradition, you also get 3 new special costumes. First up is the Knight costume, which is unique in that it's different depending on which character you're playing as. Mickey gets a lance that can attack in 4 different directions. Donald on the other hand gets a hammer that can only attack left or right, but it also has a bigger hitbox since it swings in an arc. They also each get a defensive ability, with Mickey getting a shield that can block some enemy attacks, and Donald getting the ability to roll, which can go under certain enemy attacks. And finally, they both handle very differently in water. Mickey quickly sinks with his steel armor, while Donald's wooden barrel armor causes him to float. After that is the woodcutter costume. This gives you a rope that allows you to climb trees and pillars. While climbing, you can also swing from side to side to attack enemies with your powerful cartoon butt. Or alternatively, some of the weaker enemies can even be defeated by just attacking them with the rope itself. And you can also use this costume to slide on things like vines and ropes, similar to the safari costume in the last game. And finally there's the magician costume, which isn't the same as the magician costume in the original Magical Quest. This time the costume is used to transform things. Now, sometimes this is just a different means of attack, but at other times it can be necessary to help you traverse the levels, like for instance transforming a flower enemy into a spring you can jump on, which is a bit disturbing. But hey, Mickey is the face of Disney, and Disney does what it takes to get what they want. Other than this, I really don't have too much to say about this game. It's the same formula as the previous two games, so I'd just be repeating myself. But don't get me wrong, I absolutely still think this is a great game. Sure, maybe you could wish for some more improvements, considering that the original Magical Quest was an early game for the system and this was a late release. But in my opinion, the series was strong enough that it didn't really need any significant changes. Like the other two games, Magical Quest 3 also got a port for the Game Boy Advance, and like the last game, it didn't get any significant updates from the original, except for a save feature like all the other GBA ports. However, this version of the game is still notable because unlike the original Super Nintendo version, this got an official English release. So if you want to play this game in English without resorting to emulators or repros, then the GBA port is really your only option. And luckily it is a good port. But now we're up to the last of the Capcom Disney games of the 16-bit era, so perhaps it's time to get a bit bonkers. Now, the Bonkers cartoon show wasn't exactly Disney's most well-received project. I myself would watch pretty much any crappy cartoon the TV threw at me, but even I couldn't stomach to watch Bonkers. And overall, the general consensus seems to be that this show was pretty poo. But it did still get a tie-in game from Capcom, so I guess we have to talk about it. Well, the good news is that the game is a lot better than the show itself. It's a fairly generic platformer, but it is still a platformer from Capcom. Bonkers attacks the classic way by jumping on enemies' heads, but he also has a limited number of bombs he can throw. You start off with only a maximum of 5 bombs, but by collecting police badges in the levels you can increase the number of bombs you can carry. I actually really like this mechanic, since it gives the generic pickups a bit more value than, say, the coins in Mario. Bonkers also has a dash move that when fully charged allow him to run faster and jump further. When dashing, running into an enemy also won't hurt him, though it won't hurt the enemy either. The presentation still sticks to the same high standard you'd expect from a Capcom game from this time period. The graphics actually remind me quite a bit of the Magical Quest, though of course in a more contemporary setting rather than that game's fantasy setting. And of course you also get a great soundtrack, perhaps not Capcom's best effort, but still definitely high quality. As an interesting tidbit, this game seems to be a favorite of Super Nintendo bootleggers. Both the gameplay and music has been used in several famous pirate games, including a Pokemon game and a game based on Disney's own A Bug's Life. I can't really say why this game is so popular with bootleggers. Perhaps the game is easier than normal to hack, or perhaps it's just that it's a fairly obscure but still high quality game. And that last part pretty much sums it up. It is a high quality game, even if it isn't the best thing Capcom has ever done. and that's certainly better than what Bonkers deserves. Though if I wanted to play a Super Nintendo game starring a bobcat, I'd still go with Bubsy. Yeah, that's right, I'm a Bubsy fan. Come at me, internet. Now sadly, after the 16-bit generation, Capcom and Disney's partnership seemed to die down a bit. During the 32/64-bit era, there was only one single Capcom Disney game, and that game was the magical Tetris challenge. Now, even with the huge variety of different puzzle games available today, most people would agree that Tetris is still the pinnacle of the genre, and with an amazing developer like Capcom behind it, it really should be impossible to screw this up. Well, guess what, they found a way to do it anyway. Magical Tetris Challenge offers 3 different gameplay modes. The Endless mode is the basic Tetris game, and it works pretty well. It's the same basic Tetris you've been playing since the Game Boy, so you'd really have to make a conscious effort to mess that one up. But the other 2 modes sadly don't fare as well. Up-Down Tetris is the classic versus mode. You know, the one where clearing lines on your side will cause more lines to appear on your opponent's side. This is a well-established and beloved Tetris mode, and for the most part it sticks to how it should be played. They did add a magic meter that you fill up by clearing lines or getting attacked by your opponent, and when it's completely full it will automatically remove most of the lines on your side. This does make the game slightly less skill-based, but overall I don't mind it too much. I mean, plenty of other Tetris games added modes with power-ups, and they were still enjoyable. However, this game has one more addition, and this is what really ruins it. As you know, Tetris has a box which shows you the block you'll get after you put down your current block. And yes, this game does have that too. However, it also has a second box. This one shows the second block in line, but the problem is that it's common for both players. So whoever puts their current block down first will get this one. And this tiny little addition completely changes how the game is played. Say for instance that an I block appears in this box, aka the block that you're waiting for approximately 100% of the time in Tetris. Well, because of this mechanic, you may be forced to put your current block somewhere where you don't want it, just to prevent your opponent from getting the I block before you. Or inversely, if it's a block that none of you want, then you'll both end up taking as long as possible to make sure that your opponent gets the crappy one. This completely ruins both the strategy and the pacing of Tetris, and I just can't believe that anyone thought it was a good idea, especially not game design masters like Capcom. But as bad as this was, it's nothing compared to the eponymous magical Tetris. For the most part this plays the same as Up-Down Tetris. Yes, complete with that awful second preview box. The big change here is that you're not attacking your opponent with more lines. Instead you'll attack them by forcing them to place really wonky blocks. Now, one of the cardinal rules of Tetris is to never add more blocks than the standard 7 ones. But since these extra blocks are only for attack purposes, I do think it could have actually worked if they were really careful with it. Like for instance if they only added blocks with 5 or perhaps even 6 pieces. But needless to say, they screwed it up majorly. This game can throw massive blocks of 4x4 or even 5x5 squares at you. And if you get 2 of those in a row, then I just say good luck trying to recover from that. And if all this wasn't bad enough, the presentation isn't very good either. Well, okay, the music is completely fine, but it's not exactly Capcom quality. And maybe it's not fair to say that the graphics are bad per se. They are colorful and well animated, but the sprites of the various Disney characters just look weird, especially Donald Duck. And at times the translation can be a bit awkward as well. Either that or Donald and Goofy had some type of secret romance going in the 90s. Magical Tetris Challenge can definitely be fun, but that's only because Tetris is such a good game at its core. Anything new they tried to add in this version only served to make the game worse. Europe and Japan also got a version of this game for the PS1, but it's pretty much identical to the Nintendo 64 version. However, one release that's actually fairly different is the Game Boy Color version. This was one of those rare occasions where a portable version of a game was actually better than the console version. The first thing this version does right is removing the crappy second preview box, which instantly makes the game way more enjoyable. But that's just the start of it. We also get 3 new gameplay modes, and that's beside the 3 already present in the console version. The new modes include Towering Tetris, where you have to clear a special keyhole block that's located under a constantly growing pile of garbage blocks. And then there's the more brain teaser-like Target Tetris, where you have to use a limited number of predetermined Tetris blocks to clear out all the special target blocks. And finally there's Signal Tetris. This one is a bit more complicated. In this mode, every column has 2 sets of colored squares below them. The lower row has a set pattern, but the upper row can be changed. Anytime you place a Tetris block that clears a row, the colored squares in the upper row below that block will change color. So, for instance, clearing a row with an O block will always change the color of 2 squares, while an I block can change the color of either 1 or 4 squares. And the goal here is to get the color patterns of the upper and lower row of squares to match, which is easier said than done. Aside from these extra modes, they also did some major improvements to the game's story mode. In the console version, story mode was just a succession of Tetris matches, with a little bit of dialogue between each match. But what you get here is almost like a light RPG, where you get to explore a small town and challenge various Disney characters to Tetris matches. Now, if you want to play Tetris, I'd still recommend either the true classic versions like the Game Boy and NES versions, or one of the modern versions with a lot of more convenient features. But if you for some odd reason want to play the magical Tetris challenge in particular, then the Game Boy Color version is definitely the one to go with. Now let's jump over to the next generation of consoles, more specifically the GameCube. Here we got the magical mirror starring Mickey Mouse. This is not a 3D platformer like you might expect from that time period. If you wanted that, you'd have to wait another 8 years for Epic Mickey. No, this is actually a point-and-click game. A Disney-themed point-and-click adventure game might sound really fantastic, but you should probably hold your expectations back a bit, because this game was clearly made for very, very young children. This game is slightly inspired by the classic Mickey Mouse cartoon Through the Mirror. Like the cartoon, this game takes place in Mickey's dreams, where he enters an alternate reality through his bedroom mirror. Though this time he does it to chase after a ghost, which also serves as the game's main antagonist. For the most part, the gameplay follows the formula of a classic point-and-click game, albeit slightly simplified. For instance, if you need to use an inventory item somewhere, then the pointer will automatically change to the inventory pouch. But one thing that sets this game apart are the tricks. Spread out over the rooms in the game are stars which Mickey can collect. Clicking on certain objects will give you a prompt asking you if you want to spend some stars to perform a special trick action. Doing this will often give you a new inventory item or open up a new path, so you'll generally want to try as many of the tricks as possible. And don't worry, you can't completely run out of stars, since some of them will respawn after some time has passed. And you can also find star holders that allow you to carry more stars. Every now and again you'll also get to play a more action-focused minigame, and these can also earn you some extra stars. If you happen to own the Game Boy Advance version of the Magical Quest, this game also supports the GameCube to Game Boy Advance link cable, allowing you to unlock some optional extra content for the game. The game's presentation is overall very good, the music is nice and bouncy, and the 3D graphics are for the time pretty good, though there's something that doesn't look 100% right about Mickey's character model, but it's decent enough I suppose. Magic Mirror probably won't be too enjoyable for older players, especially those who have played a lot of other adventure games, but it is a decent introduction to the point-and-click genre for younger kids. Parents or older siblings can even help out by controlling a second mouse pointer. This can be used to point out important items, or even grab onto and control player 1's pointer directly. So if you're looking for something to play together with your young kids, this one might actually be a pretty good option. But the Magical Mirror wasn't the only Capcom Disney game that the GameCube got. 1 year later we got Disney's Hide and Sneak. If the Magical Mirror was a beginner's point-and-click game, then this one is a beginner's stealth game. You play the game as either Mickey or Minnie Mouse, and your goal is to get to the end of each of the short levels while avoiding small UFOs known as Lulus. Like in the Magical Mirror, you have the ability to perform trick actions, though with this being a more fast-paced real-time game, they of course work a bit different this time. By pushing the A button, any interactable object within your reach will become highlighted. Then you simply select one and push the A button again, or push the B button to cancel. Basic actions like jumping on top of boxes or hiding in barrels are free, but some of the more special actions still require you to collect star points. The presentation in Hide and Sneak is pretty much on par with the Magical Mirror. The music is appropriately sneaky, and the graphics are for the most part pretty nice, though I could have done with a bit more variety. Actually, the game overall could have done with a bit more variety. There are some simple puzzles here and there, but the majority of your time will simply be spent sneaking past the same enemies over and over again. And it's not like the basic stealth gameplay is super engaging to begin with. It's really simplistic and easy, which does make sense since the game was made for young kids. But then it's also really frustrating, because the camera is zoomed in super close to your character, so you can barely see anything around you. And Mickey and Minnie will get knocked out from just one hit from any enemy. This will cost you 1 life and force you to restart the current area. And if you run out of lives completely, you'll have to reload from your latest save point. And I really hope you remember to save, because if you get killed without saving, you'll have to restart the entire game, including rewatching the entire unskippable intro movie. So yeah, as you might expect, I can't really recommend this game. Young children might get a little bit of enjoyment out of it, but there really are much better options. Just hold out a couple of years extra and let the kids' introduction to the stealth genre be something like Sly Cooper instead. But now let's step away from the GameCube and have a look at the first Capcom Disney game to not be released on a Nintendo console. This is The Nightmare Before Christmas, Oogie's Revenge. Now, this is an interesting game for several different reasons. First off, as the title would imply, this game is not a retelling of the movie, but rather it takes place 1 year after the events of the movie. And considering it's been 25 years since the movie came out, this might actually be the closest thing we ever get to an official sequel. But the most interesting thing about this game by far is that it's one of very few games that attempt to be a musical, and as far as I know, the only one where they integrate the musical numbers into the gameplay. The standard gameplay in this game is a 3D hack and slash beat 'em up, kind of like a very simplified version of Capcom's own Devil May Cry games. It works pretty well and is decently fun, but it's when you get to the boss battles that the unique musical aspects come into play. During these battles, Jack and the boss will be singing one of the classic songs from the movie, but of course with completely new lyrics that tie into what's going on in the game. When you attack the boss, they drop musical notes, which in turn fills up a bar at the top of the screen. When this bar is completely full, you'll enter a special mode where you have to press buttons to the beat of the music. You know, pretty much like a rhythm game. And if you do well in this little mini game, you'll perform a special attack that will do massive damage to the boss. It's not the deepest mechanics in the world, but it really does make the game feel rather unique. As for the presentation, well, that's definitely one of the game's biggest strengths. The unique art style of A Nightmare Before Christmas lends itself very well to the limitations of the PS2 and Xbox hardware. So you really couldn't ask for a much better visual representation of this world in a video game. The music is of course absolutely fantastic, and so is the voice acting, with many of the original actors coming back to reprise their roles from the movie. And don't worry, the characters that are voiced by new actors sound absolutely fine as well. The one slightly negative thing I can think of about the presentation is that, like I said before, pretty much all of the songs are recycled from the movie. Now, some of these songs I think really needed to be in the game to please the fans, but it would have been nice to have some original songs as well. Overall though, I think Oogie's Revenge is a really nice game. Sure, it doesn't have the world's deepest gameplay, but when it comes to capturing the essence of the source material, very few movie-based games get as close as this one. This, however, would be the last of the Capcom Disney games for a very long time. Oogie's Revenge came out in 2005, and we would not see another Capcom Disney collaboration until 2013. But when they came back, they did so in a big way, because this is when we got DuckTales Remastered. This was not a simple re-release of the original NES game, but a complete remake built from the ground up. Now, to be fair, this game was not actually made by Capcom themselves. It was made by the masters of retro-inspired games WayForward Technologies. But it was still published by Capcom and built on the groundwork they had created more than 20 years earlier. The gameplay itself is still pretty much identical to how it was in the original Nintendo version, but the scope of the game has been greatly expanded. All of the original levels have been given new areas to explore, and some of the levels now also have mini-bosses on top of the bosses from the original game, and the old bosses have also received expanded movesets. If that wasn't enough for you, the game also has 2 brand new levels, a short tutorial level at the start of the game, and best of all, a true final level, whereas the original NES version only made you play through the Transylvania level a second time instead. If you have played any of WayForward's other games, you know that you can expect great things from the presentation as well. The game uses 2-dimensional characters against 3-dimensional backgrounds, and the 2D graphics are absolutely amazing. I can barely think of any games that have better character animation than this. The 3D graphics, however, are not quite as good. They're definitely decent, but when you look at how great the 2D characters look, you can't help but wish that all of the graphics were in 2D. Still, the game definitely looks great. As for the music, the soundtrack from the NES version has been remastered by WayForward's regular composer Jake Kaufman, and if you're familiar with his work, then you know your ears are in for a treat. Kaufman's versions of the original NES tunes are absolutely amazing. There's also a couple of brand new compositions for the new levels, and I'd dare say that they are more than good enough to hang out with the classics. Other news on the audio front include full voice acting. complete with most of the original DuckTales cast coming back to voice their characters, including Alan Young and Yoon Foray, the voices of Scrooge McDuck and Magica the Spell, who were both over 90 years old when this game came out. Sadly, both of them have passed away since the release of this game, but I'm glad that we got to hear them reprise their roles one last time at least. Of course, while DuckTales Remastered is a great remake, it's not completely without its flaws. While there are still plenty of secrets to find, I don't feel like there's as big of an emphasis on them this time as there was in the original game, which is a big disappointment for people like me who thought the secrets were one of the most fun aspects of the original NES version. And while all of the new cutscenes are a cool addition the first time you play the game, they can become a bit of an annoyance on subsequent playthroughs, when you just wanna play the game. From a modern perspective, DuckTales Remastered is definitely a big improvement over the original game. But still, us retro gamers will probably always prefer the purity of the original NES version. And with that we're up to the final game in this long journey. So it's fitting then that this one goes right back to the beginning again. This is the Disney Afternoon Collection. What we have here is not a new game, nor a remake like DuckTales Remastered. No, these are simply 6 of the classic NES games emulated on modern hardware. This collection includes DuckTales 1 and 2, Rescue Rangers 1 and 2, TailSpin and Darkwing Duck. And while it's a bit disappointing that you don't get all of the classic Capcom Disney games, hell, not even all of the NES games, I am glad that these games are finally available for younger generations, who without the nostalgia might not be willing to put down the cash for original consoles and cartridges. Aside from the games themselves, each of the games also comes with a time trial and boss rush mode, which also have online leaderboards. And there's also a gallery that lets you listen to the soundtracks and look at original concept art for the games. The gallery is absolutely amazing for us old-timers, though I wish there was a lot more of it. For instance, a lot of other retro compilations have interviews with the people who worked on the games, giving you some extra insight into the development. But here it's only concept art. Well, I guess I can't complain too much. At least what we do get is of really high quality. I mean, I'd almost be willing to pay the full $20 price tag just for the original box arts without all the company logos on them. However, one thing that I am really disappointed about is that there's no physical release of this game. I mean, any good retro compilation deserves a physical release. And also, why the hell didn't they make a Switch version? These games belong on a Nintendo system after all, and it would be great to be able to play them portably. Either way, I am still very glad that this compilation exists. And I really hope that some of the kids that play these games today will experience the same joy as I did the first time I played them, because these games truly are timeless. And with that, this long adventure of ours has finally come to a close. I'd like to sincerely thank you if you stuck with me through this whole journey, and I hope you learned something new along the way too. I'll be back again soon enough. And with a bit of luck, hopefully so will Disney and Capcom as well.